everybody that's in person. Welcome to everybody that's online. This is new for us. This is the first time we've done a combined in-person virtual OLLI tour of the orchestra presentation, so I'm really excited to be here. My name is Sammy Johnson-Helms, and I'm the executive director of the Terre Haute Symphony, and I'm pleased to welcome our principal flute, Joyce Wilson. She's going to be presenting the flute today, and she's got a plethora of instruments to share with you today. So I'm going to hand it off to Joyce and let her tell you a little bit about herself and about what she's presenting today.
Thank you, Sammy. Yes, I am Joyce. I'm very glad to be here, and I'm so glad to see you here. It's wonderful to see people, but especially you people. I don't know all of your names, but I do recognize you. Yes, and I've seen you a lot. Gracie, I think you've come to flute events before. Okay. Okay.
Bruce and Connie McLaren and Betsy and Dick Frank as well, so you can kind of see them on this computer.
Hello. All right, the flute, maybe the oldest, most primitive of the orchestral instruments. Our history goes back 35 and 40,000 years ago, yes, where flutes are found in caves in southwestern France and Germany, when our ancestors were migrating to Europe and living alongside Neanderthals. Apparently, there's no evidence that Neanderthals made music, but we certainly did. Now, I say it's primitive because all one needs to build a flute is to have a hollow tube and then to put holes in it, some for the fingers and one for the mouth. On the cover of your program, and anything about me, I put a few little interesting notes that has nothing to do at all with a real bio. It's on the back. Does anybody need one? Need a program? Yeah, Michelle is going to put this online so you'll be able to see it. But I'd love for you to see this bone flute. The flutes they found in the caves are made of bone. The one that is on this cover is really only half a flute. It's broken. And it was probably maybe about 6 inches long. I can get emotional about this flute because somebody built this who probably had a hard life. His ancestors did not get into this cave by Delta Air, and they had to walk. And he probably had a hard time getting enough to eat and enough clothing, and maybe his neighbors were noisy and it was cold at night. But this person had a real need to make this bone sing. And he's done some very intelligent things. If you look carefully in the back of the tube, there's a little hole and it's cracked. But that's a thumb key. He had figured out, I say he, it could have been a she, probably was. But he had figured out that if he had a thumb key and coupled it with the finger keys, he'd get more notes. And the other thing he did, if you look at the mouth hole, it's cut out around the edges all the way around. Today in flute factories, we call that undercutting. If you undercut the mouth hole just a little bit, it helps funnel the air and the sound into the instrument and you get a better tone. So this person, all he had was a bone to work with, but he was working very hard to get it. He did some things that are more sophisticated than some of the flutes I'm going to show you later today. This is really quite a marvel. They found a lot of bones in these caves, so they didn't have Terre Haute Symphony there, but they may have had a bone band. Now, as time went on, materials became more sophisticated, not necessarily the construction, but I have some here to show you. By the way, here's a good Trivial Pursuit question. Do you know of any historical figures who may have played flute? Martin Luther was a good flutist. Yes. Hector Berlioz, the composer. Betsy, did she say something?
She said Cocapelli.
Oh, Cocapelli, yes. He was a very good flute player. I never met him, but he was a very good flute player. And a name that you've heard a lot in the last year or so is James Madison, one of our founders, was a very good flutist. He played a glass flute. It had a mechanism on it, and it's still Smithsonian. One of my classmates became the flute teacher, longtime flute teacher, at James Madison University in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, I believe. And when they had an anniversary, the Smithsonian said, well, we'll let you borrow James Madison's flute. So she said, great, I'll try to learn how to play it. So they brought it out in an armored car. There were 2 guards outside of her door all the time. They followed her everywhere, even to the water fountain. And she couldn't leave the flute in her room overnight. She had to stand on a padded carpet, and same when she played it. She said learning to play it and being guarded all the time was the absolute worst weekend of her life. But it was made out of glass. Here's it's a tiny glass flute. Now, I have a very small hand, so I can't play most of the flutes because my fingers won't stretch. But maybe I can give you a little idea of sound. It can play lower notes and higher notes. I'm going to try to cover some of these fingers. Can you kind of recognize the tune? Now, how did people play all the notes when there are only 6 holes here? Can you figure out how they would have done that? They coupled them, that's right, Phil. And another thing they did, I'm half-holing. And believe me, that's not a lot of fun. In grad school, I needed to play what this is called a Baroque Flute, no keys on it, for 1 semester. I think it was called 1 semester of torture. And the whole time I was thinking, please, can I just have my flute back instead of, it wasn't glass. Now, some other ones. This is a flute from Guatemala. And one of the things that they did when they started making flutes, and they made them out of ivory, they made them out of glass, sometimes metal, but a lot of times wood. This is an inexpensive piece of wood it's just been painted. But they put faces on some of them. And this guy has an embouchure and a face. It's also beautifully decorated. Now this gets a rather muted sound because there are not enough of these holes for the air to come out. It's a nice sound. And now the keys are not, the holes are not in any scientific place. A lot of times they place the holes according to a person's hand. And that doesn't always work. I'm getting almost a half step in one place and a whole another. It's not a great scientific, but it's a beautiful instrument. Here's one. I have never gotten 1 note out of this. I think there's something wrong with it. But this literally came off of an elephant's back. Even 20, 25 years ago in Vietnam, don't move. In Vietnam, the rice paddies were guarded by elephants. And on top of the elephant was a 10 or 12-year-old boy tooting a flute. This is true. And this came right off an elephant. A student's uncle went up to a boy and said, I know this flute teacher in the United States. I would really like to know where I could buy a flute like that. And the little boy said, oh, here, you can take it. I'll just make another one. I think it's made out of bamboo and it has sand carvings here. And I've never gotten one single note out of it. I think there's something wrong with the end of it. Okay, now, oh my goodness, here. This is a Chinese flute. At one time here in the Department of Music, School of Music, we had a program where the students went to China. And they were there a couple of weeks, and a flute student got to go. She took Chinese flute lessons. Now, the Chinese play our Western flute, but they also have their own folk flute. And so she took lessons, and then she kindly brought one back for me. Now, this is a long instrument, but the mouth hole is this far down. Trying to find it. Now that's a powerful sound, isn't it, compared to the others? Do you know why? It's because part of the way down the tube, there's a hole with a vibrating membrane over it. So it wiggles up and down. It kind of gives a buzz sound. And they like that in their instruments. They want to hear that buzzing sound. And it does make a very pretty sound. It makes a powerful sound. And boy, are these fingers ever, I don't know who played this. It's a very nice instrument.
Is that instrument tuned like with the pentatonic scale?
Yes, yes, it would. She's asking if it has a different scale than ours, and because it's meant for folk music in China, it has a 5, sometimes 6-note scale. But it's got a pretty tone, you have to admit that. This is an old-fashioned fife. You've seen these a lot of times. It belonged to one of my relatives. Okay, so as time went on, people began to realize that it would be much easier to play the flute if it had some keys on it. The story of that is really very complicated. I have a book about this thick, and it tells about how the keys got put on the instrument. And in order to pass your exams, when you to know a lot of this, but some of it is just ridiculous. Well, I think that my tone arm is much better than your company's. And these companies had names like Gordon and Rudelkart, which I'm sure you've heard of. And by the way, I'm going to show you a couple of big instruments like a bass flute. I don't have my bass with me, someone else has it, but I'm going to show you some big flutes. And I always thought that they were fairly recent, but in this book, in the 1600s and 1700s, they talk about alto flutes and bass flutes. So they were around a long time. They just didn't get used very much. One of my colleagues who gave a talk on the horn, Nathan, is that his name? Lane. Lane talked about how most of the innovations with the brass instruments, and that's the same thing with flutes. The piccolo was first used, the bass flute and the alto flute in the opera orchestra were more experimental. And by the way, one of the wonderful things about this series, if you've seen several of them, is how much they overlap with one another. So eventually, about the mid-1800s, a person by the name of Boehm, we say Boehm, it looks like Boehm, developed a flute with keys on it. It was wonderful. Finally, at last. He was actually a jeweler, and he played flute a little bit, and he knew that the flute needed to be better, so he went to the University of Munich and got a degree in physics to figure out where to put the keys, and he came up with a pretty decent instrument. Now, on the way to that, this is a prize here. They had 1 keys, then they put 4 keys, and then they put 8 keys. This is an 8-keyed instrument. If you want to come up afterwards and touch these, they're clean. You can do that. Now, not too many years ago, a minister from Paris, Illinois, a Presbyterian minister, came over and gave the school some things that had belonged to his late wife. On his last trip over, he handed me a Tupperware container, and he said, "This is useless, this instrument, but I hate to throw it away. So I'll give it to you." Well, it was a long time before I opened it because I thought it was a toy. And then when I opened it, oh my goodness. This is a jewel. It's a very old instrument. It has been played. It was in terrible shape. I've had to work on the wood. I've got it in pretty good shape except for one key, and it's cracked, and the barrel is cracked. This is an absolutely, I can tell by the mouthpiece it's been played a lot. This is a very old instrument, and it does sound beautiful. That's a really lovely, warm sound. And by the way, I called him after I opened it up and said, "You shouldn't have thrown this away." But he didn't want it. So I'm taking very good care of it. And if I ever get to the Smithsonian, I'm going to take it because I think they will want it. They just put a hole here and expect it. Nice instrument. So that's my pride. And all it has is a Tupperware container. Now it doesn't even have a case. Okay, so now we get to a flute. This is still evolving, if you can believe it. The first flute that I played, I grew up on, and I auditioned here and played it for many years. This Bain, who invented it, said, "Now look, I admit, this first key is in the wrong place. It's too high for one note and it's too low for another. So I'll put it in between and you figure it out." And guess what? Every D on that note flute was wrong, very wrong. So I'm playing along, and here comes a D, and I have to get out the D, police, and doctor the D up, because one of them that should have been kind of high was too low, and the one that was, it was just very, very difficult. Well, about 1970, someone in England who was very condescending about American flutes. At the time, American flutes were very good. They were called Powell and Haynes, and he said, instead of Powell and Haynes, it's Howell and Paines, because they were so out of tune. So he said, "I think I can make a flute that's better in tune." You know what he did? And what he did, if you look at my old one and this one, they kind of look alike, but the tone holes here are not all the same diameter. They start skinny and get fat. And there are some big spaces between some of the keys. And boy, is this easier to play. It's a lot easier to play. I'm so glad that that happened. Sometimes people ask me about the instrument, and they say, "Is that a handmade instrument or is it machine made?" And it's yes and yes. The tubing is machine made, but much of it is handmade. And they will say, "Well, how long does it take to make that flute?" A couple of weeks ago, I called a flute maker on behalf of a student and said, "Well, I know you're a little understaffed and wonder are you taking new flute orders?" He said, "Well, yes. Now, I've been working on one for a couple of weeks, off and on. Now, if I just had one full week to work on that flute, I would have it finished." It takes a long time. And this is probably about $25,000 now. I paid $22,000 for it. And that's not a lot for a flute, because today no, it isn't. They're expensive. We're interested in gold or in rimming the mouthpiece. I have a mouthpiece that's rimmed in gold, and make a difference. All these fancy things do make a difference. And now, especially the South Korean, Japanese, Chinese people will only play on gold because of resale value. And they sound good. So, oh, they ask about resale value. Sometimes flutes will sell for about the same as they cost. If they're taken care of, if they're good material, and if they are, if this flute right here, probably in 50 years will be worth more than it is now, because it's made by the original maker of the instrument, who will no longer be making flutes. And he's very good. Lane talked about his instrument being made in Indianapolis, one of the best flute makers in the world. I mean, in the world. His name David Straubinger, and he's in Indianapolis. And he's a kind of had to experiment with all his toys when he was a little kid. He works 20 hours a day, and he's developed a pad that's used everywhere, absolutely everywhere. Play the flute. Now, I don't suggest that you blow right now, maybe when you go home. But what I'd like for you to do is to pretend as though in the palm of your hand you have a cup of soup and you need to blow it, cool it off. Okay, we're going to take that same airstream and we're going to make it go up and down the arm from the elbow to the tip of the fingers. What are you moving to do that? Your chin. Yeah, that's our octave key. That's what directs the air in and out of the instrument. I'm doing that all with this. Okay, now we're going to add to it. I wonder if you can say E, ooh, E, ooh, E. Now, no cheating. Your mouth, you know the term embouchure, some of you. Your embouchure can't get any larger. It just changes shape. So for this little exercise, we're going to say ooh across the flute as we go up the airstream. Often in the high notes, we'll ooh a little bit anyway. Okay, we're not done yet. We've got to do something with the throat. In a way, flute players may be more like singers than other instruments. I think all instrumentalists worry about their throat, keeping the throat open. But sometimes in the real low register, we'll have our throat a little high. And then we'll lower it as we're going. So now while we blow up and down our arm and say E, ooh, E, ooh, E, ooh, we're also going to go E, ooh, E, ooh. Can you say E, ooh, E? We're dropping our jaw. So we have to learn how to do all these things. You know, it looks as though that playing the flute is about these buttons. It's not. It's about this. And Lane also told us about the overtone series. We practice the overtones. We don't have as many of them. And fortunately, they're not as dangerously close together as his. Oh, I have to remember that that's my high G embouchure. And so when I need a high G, oh my goodness, I'm getting tangled up. When I need a high G, that's what I have to do. But I have to practice my overtones long enough so when it comes in the orchestra and I need one softly, I know what to do. But that's what flute players do. Okay, now we've figured this out a little bit, and it's time to use this. Esteban, the old viola player, talked about how awkward the viola is. Alexander teachers or body mechanics teachers will tell you that the flute and the violin or viola are the worst instruments on the body because they're unnatural positions. And we used to have an Alexander teacher come here every month. He was just absolutely fantastic. And he straightened out more problems, many, many problems. And he said that flute players have chronic neck pain, back pain, all kinds of things. Fortunately, I'm not a tense player, so I don't have any problems with my fingers. And by my age, I probably should be. I mean, I'm not sure I'm controlling them all the time, but they're relaxed because I'm a pretty relaxed player. What we do in order to learn fingering is to hold the flute like this and play. Or we play games where put it behind your back now, finger D, finger an F. So students get used to it because you can't look down the tube. Piano players are not supposed to look at the keyboard, and we're not supposed to look either. Now we have a problem with the tongue. We have a big problem with the tongue. I guess a lot of us do. All of the other wind instruments get to touch something when they start to tone. We don't. There's nothing to touch. There's no reed. So what we do is we make consonants, either a t or a d. T can be kind of explosive, and d is much better. But we're always trying to start the note so that it's audible in the back of the stage. My flute teacher, when we're getting ready for a recital, we were in the recital hall, he'd run to the back of the stage and he'd say, now play. Because he wanted to know if I was enunciating, if he could tell what was going on. You do not want to get real close to the principal flute of the Philadelphia Orchestra or the principal flute of the Chicago Symphony because literally you would be blown away. We have some problems that we work on but one of them is articulation. And sometimes it really seems like it's too heavy. I used to be grossed out by my teachers. What? You want me to sound like that? Because I thought it was too much tonguing. So we have to think about that. This articulation thing is very much language related. I'll never forget a student from Japan. And when she got here, she could only play about 20 minutes. And then her whole jaw would start shaking. It was just awful. She couldn't control it. So what she would do, she'd jam the flute into her face even more. And by the way, when we put this flute up here, no pressure, none. I used to just inadvertently walk over and grab the flute. Or sometimes I would put it on a leash and try to grab it, trying to be funny, because it should be very relaxed. Also, it was just terrible. So she went to this Alexander teacher who was helping her. And then we spent 4 hours one Sunday trying to figure out what she was doing with her tongue because it was so heavy. And found out she was clucking up against the top of her mouth, almost to her throat. But that's how she spoke. So now let's talk about the flute and some of its problems. As much as I love it, it does have problems. The range of it starts in the middle of the piano. It goes up for 3 octaves and 2 notes. You can shriek out a few more notes above that. And in Terre Haute Symphony, I have had to play a high F many years ago. It was horrible. Better stick with the traditional notes. The thing is that in the low notes, does that sound like the middle of the piano? Probably not. It's a little more fuzzy. And it's because of the tone color. That note doesn't project very well. So some of the things that we do is with tone color, especially in the low notes. I could play a note this way. Do you hear a little bite in the sound? I'm doing that with what I do with my lips and with airspeed. And that puts more overtones in the sound and it should make it project. Another thing I'll do is use an oscillation of the sound, a vibrato. And we flutes probably use more vibrato than some other instruments because in the upper register, we're always trying to be fat. Because our sound at a distance can sound like one of these toy flutes, very thin. And so we're always doing things to try to make ourselves be a little fatter. Now, are there any questions?
You actually do have questions out there.
Good.
So, okay, Betsy. She shared a link for jmw.edu, and then she said, "Who invented the flutophone?"
The flutophone.
That's what she wants to know. And then she wants to know how many flutes you own.
Yeah, how many? Well, right now I own 3 of these, and I own a bass, which I haven't shown you, and I don't have. And I have an alto, and I have a piccolo, and I have all of these flutes, and I've got to do something with them because they're expensive. And I own head joints. You know, don't you wish we could interchange our heads? Well, flute players are crazy about that. I don't know about the flutophone, so if Betsy wants to tell me, I would really appreciate it. A flutophone?
I don't know. She's got out there. And then she wanted to tell you what a great teacher you are.
Oh, thank you. How kind. It's very kind of you. Let me show you a couple of the larger instruments, and then if I have time, I'll play a little bit. It's 1:30. Oh, my goodness. Oh, I keep getting tangled up. Okay, this is an alto flute. And it comes with two heads. If I didn't want to play a straight piece, I could put this in, and it would bring the instrument a little closer to me. But most alto flute players believe that if they use the flute in a straight piece, it produces a better tone. So I'm going to use the straight piece. It's a nice sound, isn't it? This is just about the only transposing instrument we have. When you play a C, you get a C on most flutes. Not this. When you play a D, you get an A. So it's one of the few transposing instruments, probably because of its size. But even the bass flute, and the bass flute looks like a big flute, except it has a boomerang on the end. The bass flute looks exactly like something you find under your kitchen sink. And you do have to call a plumber to fix it. There are some solo pieces. It sounds like that. And they were reminding me there's such a thing as a contrabass flute that you stand up to play. It looks like a big A. Very expensive, and bass and flute choirs are using them now. We can't afford one, but we do have a bass flute and use it sometimes. And then the piccolo. The piccolo now is in C. Great story about this. When I was in 6th grade, my parents asked the band director if he would like a piccolo, and he said yes. Oh, I hated the stupid little thing. Well, it made too much noise. It was too high and squeaky, and I was so shy. Oh, but they bought me this piccolo in 6th grade, and they piccolo, and it was about Piccolo Pete goes tweet, tweet, tweet. I'm not kidding you. That was it. So I practiced Piccolo Pete goes tweet, tweet, tweet at home until I felt comfortable. And then I took my piccolo into band the big day. Oh, my goodness. It was the worst sound I've ever heard in my life. What is wrong with this piccolo? So I pulled it out, put it back in. I took it home and I tried it out with the piano, and I figured out it was a half step wrong. Well, I didn't know this transposition, I didn't know anything about that, but it was wrong. But I couldn't tell my parents because they didn't have a lot of money and they were so excited about this squeaky little piccolo. They wanted me to play. I just couldn't tell them. So this was before photocopy. That's how old I am. And before I couldn't write anything in the music. So I had to sit at the piano and memorize what I was supposed to play. Well, it got easier because band music was so much easier than piano music. So finally in the 8th grade, my band director looked at me and said, Joyce, you're not fingering the right notes. And I said, oh, I can't. My piccolo's broken. I won't play the right notes. He just solved. He understood why my parents got a deal. They bought a D flat piccolo. And I didn't even know what. I still have that silly little thing. Now, this is a C piccolo, and this is built like an ice cream cone. All the other ones are cylinders, but this is fat in the middle, and that's the case with wooden instruments, but it's really skinny. One time, when I was a grad assistant, one of the big boys was fooling around with the piccolo. He got his finger stuck. We had to go get him a lubricant to get him unstuck. It's very small. This is a wooden piccolo. It's a nice instrument. I don't get to play it very much. Well, I haven't played it for a while. You can tell that. I better not try it. I haven't played it for so long. But it also, it's fat in the middle, so it's way different from these instruments. And it also has a raised lip plate. So we have a very good piccolo player in the orchestra. Her name is Elizabeth. And right now she's actually working on a master's over at Eastern Illinois, but she's still playing in the orchestra. Are there any more questions? Okay. This is a bird. It's from the Symphony Number 6, the Pastoral Symphony by Beethoven. And it's a nightingale. Now, unfortunately, this bird only knows 2 notes. So that's okay, it's just a bird. And usually this is played, some conductors will let the flutist go ahead on these bird cadenzas and not conduct. Ray Meyer, if you may remember him, he would let us go. Once upon a time, there was a powerful emperor. He lived in an old castle high in the Blue Mountains and the green forests. The castle was guarded by fierce soldiers on horseback with swords. On the terrace, behind iron bars, was the one thing the emperor really loved: bird of paradise. Now, this is Vivaldi's version of a goldfinch. I'm afraid we've got another 2-note bird here. So. Okay. Now we come to the blackbird. And we know these are ground feeders, and they're not nice. They don't share. And they're feisty, and they fight. The person who wrote this solo is Oliver Messiaen, who is an ornithologist, a serious ornithologist. I've heard some wind ensemble pieces that were amazing, where the clarinets were playing quarter tones. I don't know if you've ever done. Yeah, I heard that at a convention. It's an amazing piece, absolutely amazing. He did pretty well with the flute playing a blackbird. There are two cadenzas in it, and I'll play one of them. Now, some things to listen for. You'll hear a flurry of activity, and then you'll hear a little tiny bird kind of back away. This is not going to sound like Mozart, by the way. Apologetic. At the end, the bird flies away. But before he does, he gets in a big fight. And then he flies away. That's called flutter tonguing. I do it in my throat. I'm much better at it than. So here's a cadenza, and imagine blackbirds probably fighting. To get our throats open, sometimes flute players will practice singing at the same time because, yes, there's a theory, and I believe in it, that for every note you play, there's a position in your throat that you should assume to get the best tone. Have any of you ever heard of The Voice of the Whale by George Crumb? Probably my favorite piece in the whole world. It's for electric flute, piano. It's for trio, and there's a huge vocalese at the beginning of it that it's supposed to be reminiscent of the song of the humpback whale, and it goes through all the periods. It's probably the most rewarding piece I've ever done. Anyway, the flute has to sing through the whole vocalese and play at the same time. Okay, now the next bird, and it's on your program. The bluebird looks so big. He's not. The reason I chose it, this is the bird that sits on Peter's shoulder in Peter and the Wolf. And Peter's just a little boy, and he's disobeying his grandfather. He's going out in the forest. He's not supposed to. And on his shoulder is a little bird. And I chose the mountain bluebird because it's my favorite. Have you ever been to the Tetons or places out west? Even Yellowstone is too warm for them. They're little tiny birds. They can fit in the palm of your hand, bright blue, and they flit around in the trees. And so I chose a mountain bluebird. This is Peter. And at first, you just hear chirp, 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 and then he flies away. That's when he's chirping. And then at the end, he flies away. One more piece, I'll just play a little bit of it. Bird call. And this is a very long cadenza. And as far as I'm concerned, these birds are from Alfred Hitchcock. It's very hard. Yes, that's right. But there's a flyaway here also. So if you'll permit me. supposed to fly away at the end. Is that enough?
We've got all kinds of questions. So one of my first ones is you were talking, and you might have to repeat this. Bruce, can you hear me? Can you shake your head? That's very good. Okay. So you might have to repeat my questions for him. You said that, you know, it's an unnatural position that you hold. So what kind of damage do you get? Do you have to worry about arthritis in your fingers or in your shoulder?
Some people do. I'm a really tense person. I mean, I overdrive all the time, but not with this. I don't know whether I had good teachers. I didn't used to worry about playing the flute. You know, I've been in some pretty tough situations. If you read on the back, when I was an undergrad, I played for a week with Igor Stravinsky. That was a little high-powered. I didn't worry about it. You know, when you're 19, and so I don't think I've ever been really tense. Yeah, no, flute players do get problems and they have to quit. Many flute players have to quit because it's unnatural. The best thing to do, I think, is to take Alexander lessons. And I have had some of them, mostly here at Indiana State. I had a great teacher. It's a system of body mechanics that helps. And I can tell you what I was doing wrong. When I first went to this man, I was trying to breathe too deeply. So I was stretching my rib cage out too much. And I don't have that much rib cage. I was killing it. So you have to be careful with things like that.
Makes sense. All right. How about if you ask the people on Zoom if they have any other questions and tell them to go ahead and unmute?
Are there any questions from anyone?
I kind of was wondering if, when I hear you play just about all the flutes, this sounds so strange, but the flute seems to have a mind of its own.
I agree.
It's a beautiful thing. It's like there's two of you playing the instrument. The flute's playing back what you're playing, and it adds something to it. I don't know. It's mysterious.
I think I know what you mean. And sometimes I feel that way, especially when I'm at home. Right. The flute is what you put into it. And if you've played it a long time, you know the instrument. As an example, I could probably pick up anybody else's instrument, just like this one, and I would know whether it's mine. When I was in high school, we all played Haynes flutes. They were the same vintage. And so we would put them down and close our eyes and then go pick up our instruments. We get that connected. And I'm sure Sammy feels that way about her clarinets, that she would know her instrument over others. Yeah. Kind of. Yeah. It's a very nice thing to do. It's a wonderful life. And teaching flutes an even better life. And playing chamber music is utopia. Playing small groups is absolute utopia. The voices, well, I've gotten to do the Debussy, flute, harp, and viola trio twice. And I'm sure that was pretty close to heaven. What those sounds. And I did them both here.
Okay, so we've got a question from Betsy. Betsy wants to know how many hours a day you practice.
Well, since I retired, I practice 2 or 3 hours a day. And I'm making changes. I took the cork out of, I told you this is always evolving. I took the cork out of the end of this instrument because cork absorbs vibrations. And just a couple of months ago, I put a resonator in and it made it heavy. And I thought, oh no, I'm not going to be able to do this. It doesn't bother me at all. But I can get much more power in the low register. I love this resonator. I wish I'd done it a long, long time ago. So we're always making changes.
How many hours did did you practice before you retired then?
I didn't get to practice very much.
Oh, okay.
Because my job here was, I would have as many as 22, 25 students. And they were always off going to some competition. I didn't have to do that. But that's my life. My passion is teaching. And if the student wanted to do something or wanted extra time, and frankly, some students, okay, I had a rule beginning, don't come into this office unless you're prepared. You have to have something prepared. You can tell me when you walk in, and don't try to fake it, because I can figure out when you're sight reading. And you can just tell me what's ready and we'll listen to it. And then Friday you come back with your solo. So that meant I was teaching 2 or 3 times a week until I got the kids straightened out. And most of the time they didn't want to be dismissed. If they got dismissed, and they didn't want to be dismissed. They wanted the lesson. It's 1-to-1. They liked the flute or they wouldn't be there. And so, they shaped up. So I worked more than I needed to. And it cut into this, I realized. But I did it and I enjoyed it.
Now, you're part of the flute
The choir. Yeah.
So how many flutes are in the flute?
About a dozen.
Okay.
Yeah, and now this is not one of the flute choirs that is pretty much, there are many flute choirs in this country where all you have to do is read 3 sharps and 3 flats. That's all. Not much requirement. We do. Ours is professional. It's really professional. And unfortunately, 2 of them come from Washington, Indiana. That's a long way off. And 2 of them come from Bloomington. And so sometimes we have trouble getting together. But the people who are in it are serious. And, it takes me a long time to get music together and to do things like that. And so, yeah, it's fun. It's nice.
Oh, okay. Another question came in. This is from Dick. He wants to know what kind of pieces are usually required for orchestra auditions, and are these some standard flute solos?
The orchestra auditions are usually, now when I auditioned, I played the Ibert Concerto as well as orchestral auditions. But that's because that's what they wanted. Now it's just orchestral audition, and I played some of them, like the one from the Alfred Hitchcock, that's on there. The Afternoon of the Faun, which I love to play. I always hope to do that again. So yeah, those are the pieces. There's a piece by Beethoven, the Eroica is on there. But standard, and there's a beautiful Bach piece on there. So, and mostly they tend to be the same throughout the country. No solos now, almost none. And actually no sight reading, which is a surprise to me because I've always had to. Just this year, I had a student who was auditioning for the Chicago Civic. And he played the same 4 audition pieces that he's been playing all the way through college. And the Mozart. We always play Mozart. They want to hear Mozart. Oh, you wanted a joke? That's not my only joke I have. You want to hear it?
Yes.
Okay. What's worse than 1 flute? 2 flutes. What's worse than 2 flutes? Nothing. That's what Mozart said about us. Can you believe it? I think I can understand because the flute back in Mozart's day was not much better than some of these I played. He said that about us. Mozart did not like the flute. It's really true. He didn't. And he had to be paid big bucks to write. And the Mozart Flute and Harp Concerto was written for a father and a daughter, and the daughter was a better harpist, so that got the hard part. The flute part's piece of cake because the guy wasn't very good, and he wrote to what he had. So,
reading the information about you, what was, because from a little kid on, when
Oh, my parents. Yes, they were wonderful. But yeah, no, very, very early on. I don't know why. I was not raised around music. My parents are all business people. My dad was in the steel industry. My mom worked for a newspaper. There was nobody in music. There was none in this little tiny town where I was. But I remember I learned how to tell time because my mother forgot to tell me to go turn the radio on to listen to the Lone Ranger. And the reason I wanted to listen to the Lone Ranger was a little snippet of the Rossini William Tell Overture. That's why. That wasn't going to happen again. So I had her show me when the big hands on the six and little hands on the. That's when I go to the radio and went. So that was there, and then the radio, a radio. I got a new radio. Sammy's heard this, so she's tired of it. I got a new radio when I was 7, and I was fooling around with it. It was a clock radio, and I caused it to go on at 3 a.m. and 3 p.m. Yeah. And there was this sound. I never heard anything like it. Well, my grandmother got up and turned the radio off. But the next morning I thought, oh, my new radio can get this special music. So I got up, turned all the dials. It was gone. It wasn't there anymore. I spent days and weeks turning the dials, looking for that special music. And I was haunted by it. I thought about it a lot. And then we were in the car in the middle of the night about 3 years later, going someplace, and my dad was surfing the radio, and he came up. It was Music Till Dawn from WGN. And I said, stop! What is that? It was a symphony. I never heard a symphony. And they knew that. My parents were pretty savvy. They figured it out. And thank goodness they started supporting me. And they've told me many, many times. They took me to National Music Camp, Interlaken Arts Academy now. And everybody thought that would be too much because I was only 14. You had to take 2 classes every day, academics, theory or history. And then you had to go to rehearsals. You had to take lessons. And I had this wonderful private lesson teacher. We didn't have enough money for me to have 2 lessons a week. So she gave them to me. She must have seen something there. And then when my dad wanted to try to pay her, she wouldn't take it. I will never, ever forget that woman. And she was famous. But you had to do a lot of things. And so everybody assumed that I would be burned. And I wasn't. I was ready to go. That was it. From then on, I wanted to hear every piece I could. I wanted to play every piece I could. And I didn't care about the Bloody Friday auditions at Interlochen. It was okay. I didn't get worried about things. And now I get hysterical if I have to play 2 notes. That's age for you. But yeah, you know that, Phil. You're a psychologist. You know it's the background that you get, your parents. And all of you who have raised children know that. And sometimes we don't appreciate them enough when they're here, but we certainly do later. And you know, it's wonderful. Music is a good life. All your grandchildren now are in music.
And my kids all love music, growing up and played and sang.
Yeah. And you still sing.
I play the piano.
Do you? So do any of the rest of you play music?